I'm Keith Parker, and this is Radical Reality Conversations on Consciousness. In this special series inspired by my book, Radical Reality, I connect with leading voices from across disciplines to explore the nature of consciousness, reality, and existence itself. These are not debates. They are open-ended conversations rooted in curiosity, shaped and informed by lived experience, and enriched through the cross-pollination of ideas. What is consciousness? Where does mind meet matter? How do we reconcile the mystical with the measurable? This is a journey through the inner and outer cosmos, an invitation to inquire into what it truly means to be. Before we begin this first conversation, I want to take a moment to frame why this dialogue matters, both for this series and for the broader inquiry into consciousness itself. My guest today is Tom Kenyon. Tom's work sits at a rare intersection: neuroscience and sound, psychotherapy and mysticism, rigorous inquiry and direct experience. Over several decades, he's explored how sound, frequency, and vibration interact with the human nervous system and brain, and how altered states of consciousness can be accessed, stabilized, and integrated. He's also one of the greatest sound healers alive. What makes this conversation especially relevant to Radical Reality is that it touches one of the central questions of the series: is consciousness something the brain produces? Tom approaches this not only through theory, but through lived experience. His work invites us to consider whether sound is merely sensory input or whether it can function as a bridge between different states of awareness and perhaps even different levels of reality. This conversation is an entry point, a tuning fork of sorts, for the series ahead. Let's begin. I'm here with Tom Kenyon. What have you been up to lately, to start small? What's been going on with you?
A period of moving inward and outward. After COVID, the COVID fiasco, everything got messed up. So I was really internal and not teaching at all, not working. I was working, but not teaching. So I'm starting to do some of that online. But the main rhythm is paying attention to me, because the island, Orcas Island, is turning into winter. So there's an element of when the light disappears from the sky and there's mist. And when the sun does show its head, it's through the mist. And so you're in another world. And so it's a very much, the island is like moving all energies inward. So that's what I'm about, which is interesting. I'm having this conversation with you about something very deep as I'm simultaneously moving further and further inside in preparation for winter.
How important have you found following the natural flow of rhythms in terms of how the environment informs your, external and internal environments, given, for example, you're living where you are in the Pacific Northwest on the islands outside of Seattle, right? That region. How has that played a factor in your life, as time has gone on as well, in terms of following and being in harmony with the rhythms of nature?
Well, it's interesting in that I've just recently started really going into some research in the fields of light synthesis, fractal energy. And I found it very interesting. Our house is on a long lane through trees, and you really don't see people that much. And I noticed as I was walking, the light patterns were changing, of course, because there's less sunlight. But when the light shines through the trees, it creates this fractal pattern that's very clear. And I started paying attention to it. In the past, I would just walk by it. But because I've been reading about this in this fascinating research about the effects of light, I'm paying more attention. And it really is something to look at sunlight from different perspectives and move through a natural environment like trees and feel just present. And reminder of Ram Dass's thing, just be here now. Yeah, just be here now. When I go for a walk, I have to turn off my brain sometimes because I'm running these things I need to do. And I just say, cool it. We're just walking and be present. And it's restorative.
Yeah, I've noticed just looking at, when you see a big body of water, whether it be a lake or even the ocean or a sound, and you have lights on the other side, like a city is on the other side of a bay, and the amount of complexity of just the reflection in the water, the way the light hits the water and the water keeps moving and that the reflection keeps undulating. The complexity and the beauty of something like that is awe-inspiring. And it begs the question of asking, when I look at that, just what kind of experience are we having right now when we think on the surface that things seem simple and something just like a reflection of light on the water is both so beautiful and so complex at the same time? What about the complexity of the deeper aspects of, the kind of the architecture of life all the way down to the bedrock of consciousness, for example?
The complexity that we see in some reflections is also an aspect of the creation, this universe we're in, the physical universe. If we pay attention to it in a way that we are relating to something that is ourselves, even though we perceive it as separate from ourselves, it is at the deepest fundamental level. We're all interconnected, whether we like it or not. We may not like other people, have issues with them, but guess what? We're all interconnected. The entire cosmos is interconnected. And we're finding now that planetary movements are affecting things that are happening here on Earth. This has been known for, of course, centuries and centuries, but modern science is beginning to look at, wow, there's something really going on when the solar flares go off. What's happening for people, what's happening for plants and animals. So it's a very complex tapestry. And since this conversation, you wanted to go into consciousness, it just poses to me immediately the paradigm and the difficulty of being a modern human being, because we are carrying with us the cultural history that we built up to this point as a civilization. And we tend to see ourselves as separate from creation, separate from everything that we're surrounded by. And that's true to some extent. But at a deeper level, we are so deeply connected into what's actually happening around us. And so that I think that it was an error when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And that started the European Enlightenment, of course, and we have technology and the wonderful creations of science. And it's, of course, a mixed bag at this point. However, at the central vector, when he said, I think, therefore I am, he moved the entire compass of our civilization into the mental realm. And the mental realm can be disconnected from reality in very profound ways. So our culture is rolling along with this premise that is actually, in my opinion, an error. And other researchers and philosophers far more advanced than I have also have quandaries about this. So when we're looking at the trees and I'm walking, or you're out looking at a reflection in the water, when we hold ourselves as separate from that experience, that's the certain set of vibratory experiences we have. But if we are looking at it from the standpoint of this is I'm part of this expression, whatever it is, it opens a different vibrational field, and you can access a whole different terrain of thoughts, emotions, and actions.
Yeah, it makes me think of John Archibald Wheeler's "There's no out there out there," and even something like pop cultural, like Neo from the Matrix. How there's really this continual thread of connectivity that is the architecture behind what we see as physical. And the yogis called this the difference between Maya, the illusory level of reality, versus like an absolute. And interestingly, Einstein came forward and then called time and space relativity, right? And so in some ways, I make that link to seeing that that is the Maya, that is the relative, that is the form, so to speak. But there's like something that is formless or continuous or unified behind everything else. And there's this gap of architecture that I'm particularly interested in, which is the energetic, which is the mental, the things that we know that we have that we don't actually understand where they are. Like this is fundamentally consciousness is a very deep, profound, can you get further kind of question. I'm interested in the bus stop of mind and just saying, hey, to the average person, you know you have a body, right? And the person says yes, yes, and say, do you know you also have a mind? And they go, yeah, I'm pretty sure about that one. So they say, okay, where is your mind? Where is it? And a person knows where their body is. They're pretty comfortable with that idea. But the idea of knowing where the mind is or what the mind is entirely an unknown question and is the beginning, in a certain sense, to me, of the rabbit hole of consciousness as a question altogether.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of a statement Carl Prieber made, the researcher, that there's no such thing as a mind. A mind is a process running parallel to processes in the brain. So I think that if you look at the way I look at things is through the lens of spirituality, but neuropsychology, and I was a psychological counselor for decades. So I look at that through that lens. And so Pilgrim's statement is accurate to some point, but in another way, it's not, in that there is more and more research coming out in the fields of neuropsychology and neuroscience that the brain is non-localized, that the brain has aspects, connections to other things that are far outside the physical domain. And it's becoming very clear that the brain can access information that it doesn't usually have access to through certain mental states and emotional states. So I would refer anyone who's interested in this area to the work of Dr. Win Wenger, Winwenger, PhD, created a program called Project Renaissance. And his whole thing is moving people into genius states very rapidly. So he teaches people to play classical piano in an unbelievable short period of time. And he develops something called image streaming, which is a way to use the verbal part of the mind to connect to the other part of the mind that is nonverbal, and it increases our effectiveness in the world. And it's been shown to increase measurable IQ up to 1 point for every 60 minutes of usage. So there's something that we hold in our heads, but it is both local and non-local. That's how I view it. It's that, yes, you and I are having a conversation because the neurotransmitters in our brain are operating at a certain level that allows us to communicate, and that is brain function. But there's another aspect, the field effects of you and me having this conversation is bringing different types of information into our brains that allows us to go in new directions, perhaps.
This brain mind question, what has happened in our culture is that people just actually ascribe mind to brain as though they are a one-to-one thing, that my mind is my brain is my mind. Now, I have a real problem, I could say, or I feel like this is just so obviously error ridden. It seems that there's this real issue with ascribing mind to brain, that being the same thing. And a really obvious error or gap that to me is completely unexplained. And I'm, interested from a scientific standpoint, anybody who does hold this perspective that mind is brain. It's a simple kind of suggestion, which is if you think of a red balloon, right? If you imagine a red balloon and you can record a bunch of neurosynaptic firings that correlate with the thinking of the red balloon, how do you bridge the gap of where is that red balloon? What is the jump? What's the gap that explains what the actual experience, the imagination, what have you, of the red balloon is versus neurosynaptic firings? Because they're not the same thing. If you were to say mind is brain or brain is mind, and they're exactly the same, neurosynaptic firings are not the red balloon. They're just neurosynaptic firings that correlate to a red balloon. What do you think of this kind of a gap, or how do we deal with this kind of mysterious space?
Well, I like the metaphor that someone I read many, many years ago, and I can't give credit, but he said that the neurosynaptic firings we're talking about are like the footprints in snow left by snow leopards. The animal is not the print in the snow. The animal is a mystery that we don't actually see with our eyes. It's very hard, very rare to see a, snow lion. So it's a perfect metaphor. So yes, synaptic firings correspond to something that's going on, but that's not necessarily the source of the information. So modern neuroscience is tilted towards total physical explanation of consciousness. There are some breaking through. Some researchers are saying, wait, over here, take a look at this. I've sent people to Dr. Bruce Lipton and his work with the pineal gland and how that is the antenna for other levels of consciousness to communicate with the biology of our nervous system. So it's a very, very good source to look at. But what my experience is exactly what you said. It is not a physical, the nexus that's creating the phenomena is not coming from the brain, it's coming from somewhere else, and the brain's responding. That's the best way I can put it, to something that is more ephemeral than we currently understand. I think our instrumentation is getting finer and finer. There's a new science called photobiophotomics, which is looking how every cell of the body emits light, measurable, quantifiable light. We're not talking about new age light. We're talking about measurable light in the lab. So when you have that in science, you really have something. So biophotonics is opening up the entire universe of these light pulsing energies in our body and how they communicate in the complex webs of interconnectedness between our organs, but also the complex webs between you and me and every other human being, and perhaps every other sentient being on this planet.
There are tests that show that if you and I were to focus in a particular object, like if I held up a pencil, for example, and we were to then focus on the pencil and we took a voltage meter before and after we did that to measure the voltage around the space or the field around the pencil, it's the voltage would measurably go up once we put intense concentrated focus on the space of the pencil. And so there's evidence to show and confirm essentially that attention actually goes where you place it in space, so to speak. And it's not, like you were saying, it's non-local to the physical body, but actually can be displaced or can move anywhere your attention, i.e., like the flashlight of your awareness or consciousness in a way, goes. So this is starting to talk about where is the mind and that it isn't local and that your brain isn't the thing that necessarily anchors what the mind is, but is rather something like a lower dimensional footprint in the snow. It seems that the movements in science, although they keep improving instrumentation and resolution, it seems that the model itself might be fundamentally flawed. What do you think about the trappings of working within the paradigm, or like kind of what kind of might help us get over the hump? You know, is AI the harbinger or the beginning of showing us what actually is going to push the envelope to realizing that we're in a much more interconnected world?
AI is the beginning of something, that's for sure. I think it's going to have an effect far beyond what the Gutenberg Bible had an effect on in our civilization. I think it's a mixed bag, a very, very mixed bag. But in answer to the question, what could allow us to jump out of the box that we're in, perhaps having a little less hubris as a civilization and as a scientist. I find it very funny that we now know, because the instruments have changed and got more sophisticated, that the brain goes up in way above 100 cycles per second, hertz, or even beyond that. But at the beginning, neuroscience said the brain goes up to 30 hertz and that's it. The brain simply does not go above 30 hertz. Well, the reason they came up with that was because they had ink pens on graph paper that would go up and down. And if it went above 30 hertz, it would go off the paper. So did nobody think, let's make the paper larger? No. They just said the brain does not go above 30 hertz. And of course, we know that's not true, much more complex. But science is the creation of the human psyche. And so in the human psyche, you have so many things pulling at you as a researcher. You have your finances you have to handle. You have to get funding. You have to do it in a way that you won't be discredited. So you may have to fit yourself into the paradigm that science is operating under that moment. And the paradigm in science is weighted towards physicality is the reason for whatever happens. And I think that's a narrow view. I think it's more complex than that. And you can include both. It's like Newtonian physics and quantum physics don't negate each other. They're totally compatible, but they're describing different realms of reality, different realms where the physics are operating. But they are compatible, even though they look antithetical. So same thing with science and spirituality. Because for me, when we talk about consciousness, that's what we're talking about fundamentally, is what is consciousness and what is this thing called spirit, and how have people looked at it for millennia, and how does science now look at it? It's a very exciting time. It's a confusing time for sure, but it's also an exciting time from the advances that are taking place in the sciences, in especially the subtle realms, what is called subtle energies, subtle energy research.
Wouldn't it be fascinating to be able to measure subtle energy a lot better as you're describing certain things about biophotonics, the body emitting light and things like that? My particular intrigue is with higher dimensions, like that we are in a kind of multidimensional or higher dimensional system, and the physical, the way I look at it, the physical is a lower dimensional representation of a multidimensional system, and what we call the energy field is in general the classical sense of the aura are those higher dimensions, and it's where that body mind connection is happening, where the non-local aspects of this experience right here and right now actually do have objective structure and existence that are measurable, that are detectable, but we don't have the instrumentation to do it because we don't even have a model to understand. How would you measure the fifth dimension? How would you measure the sixth dimension, even though cutting edge physics suggests those are existing, and even more so, cutting edge neuroscience is showing that the brain is functioning primarily in these higher dimensions as well, if you know about the Blue Brain Project.
And something you said earlier about attention is where the mind goes to. And so if you look at the technologies that have been developed in the history of humanity for people to access other states of consciousness, you can call it spirit, whatever you want to call it, those methods have been developed over centuries. And if you look at the collectively, each, without getting into the philosophical conflicts between them, because there are fundamentally deep schisms between these various systems, but most of them are saying, pay attention to this. They're pointing you in a direction to pay attention to, and the Buddha even said essentially the same thing. What you pay attention to expands and grows. So the Dharma is about a path of paying attention to what really matters underneath the play of sensory display, and make contact with that and pay attention to that, pay attention to that. So it brings me back to the statement you said earlier, which I think is very true. It's about attention. What we pay attention to has a profound effect, and we don't. Our culture is so oriented toward money, and um, so research is biased. So the research, it's been shown in the field of psychoimmunology that a person can affect their health just by how they think, how they feel. It's having a profound effect on their health, and this is self-empowering. And then we have the culture that says, well, take this pill. We've created this pill, take this pill, and that's all you have to do. And there are all these side effects that we're finding are just horrible. So as a culture, and science is just a product of a human psyche and a cultural path to knowledge. And so it is affected, science is affected and constrained by the monetary underpinnings of research. Because if you look, I remember a good friend of mine who died during COVID was a wonderful doctor, and he was the head of an emergency department in Texas at a huge hospital. And he was asked by the directors of the hospital to come and meet with them because they wanted to find out what he was doing. And he said, well, what do you mean? And so we'll tell you when you get here. So he got there, and there are all these people at a board table. And he said, so tell us how it is that your patients get out of the hospital several days earlier than anyone else's. There are fewer complications. We're saving money at this end. What are you doing that we can incorporate? And he said, well, first of all, I don't give them pharmaceuticals. I give them natural medicines. And they said, that's it. We don't need to know. We don't need to know anymore. So they were just closed because there was not a monetary factor in that. And it plays a huge role in how science is conducted.
And that's going to create a major limiting factor to the openness of actually moving towards truth and models that are congruent with what's real.
Yeah.
It's a big, big problem.
Yep. It is.
But as you're saying, it would seem that the entire culture would have to change in order to have that fundamental value object called money, a monetary currency based system be the thing that's the guiding force. Like I've not spent a lot of time thinking about this specifically. What is a replacement or an advancement in our society? What is it to move forward, to evolve to a different level of function? and peace and harmony amongst ourselves. And the thing that always stands out to me is the fundamental values and presumptions about who we are is the thing that moves the buck forward more than anything. And as you were saying earlier, separateness, this idea of maintaining a sense of I'm just this physical body and you're just that physical body, and how I think, how I feel is my private life, and you have your private life over there. And in that sense, I'm separate and the consequences are separate. Well, in reality, they're not. And as you're saying, there are things like showing how you think affects how you heal. And we might say, well, that's interesting that science proves that, but it's also self-evident to every single person that that's also the case in terms of their direct experience. The idea that what can you know directly versus what do you need measured externally? And science is wonderful for measuring things and having studies and controls and having peer-reviewed papers and doing things that we have this kind of consensus of saying, look over here, here's enough data to agree upon that. But at the same time, I fear the disempowerment that comes to the individual, the average individual, who feels that they can't actually know the truth themselves, basic things like how I think affects my health, right? Because that's something, again, that it seems self-evident. When I'm having positive thoughts and I'm having a good day, when I feel good, when I'm balanced, I know that my health is improved versus a day that I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety or turbulence or conflicts with somebody or things like that. It seems self-evident. What do you think about this empowerment, disempowerment in relation to people, in a certain sense, knowing for themselves what is true, what's not?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and it's on multiple levels. In medicine, it's very clear. I was in a store like a few months ago, and there was something on the shelf and it was the last one they had. And I said, "Could I get the whatever it was?" And she looked at the computer and said, "Oh, we don't have it." And I said, "Well, it's up there." I said, "But it doesn't exist for me. If it's not here, it doesn't exist for me." Okay. So, and I think that society has a bias. And historically, there's no point in going to that because it'd be so long and a difficult conversation, how we got shaped to the point where we don't trust ourselves. We don't trust ourselves. And we get these messages all from all these directions. But in terms of the science affecting how people view themselves, we're on a stage in this moment in time as a culture, as a planet, going through tremendous difficulties, old things dying away, new things coming forward, instability, all types of things are happening at once. And so the person can be dwarfed by all this that's going on. So paying attention to what is you're feeling and what you're thinking will have a tremendous impact upon your health and how you think about yourselves, which affects your behavior and affects your social interactions. And there's a feeling that from the standpoint of looking at the limitations of human consciousness, it's good to acknowledge the limitations, but I think it's also good to look at the other things that are more open-ended. So that empowering the individual to take a look at himself, herself at a deep, deep level and realizing that you can change something. That's a very powerful thing to possess in yourself. And the culture doesn't generally provide that. It provides obstacles to that realization.
I'm still also with what you talked about with the medicine at the store or the box on the store. I found that really fascinating because it almost sounded like a parable versus an actual experience. But there is that strange thing that has happened where there's such a strong disconnect between individual agency versus an interface with a kind of a system. Like it made me think of just how, I don't know, customer service, okay? Customer service, the idea of working with companies and businesses, airlines, phone companies, used to be somehow you'd have a human interaction and people would talk and you can figure something out. And now there's this thing where you go into this maze of automated messaging, tiers of management. And if something happens, it's like it's gone from the idea that I was the customer, I'm trying to solve something and somebody's trying to help me solve it to I have a problem and it will become such a greater problem to try and fix something. Like that it's so complicated to fix simple things because everybody is disempowered within the chain that works within the corporate structure. And it's kind of wild. And that thing that you talked about reflects that in a weird way, in a very obvious way. But it's also somehow eerily symbolic to me of this disconnect, like you're saying, about just how can a person just be with the moment and know what's real and what's not real? And this kind of corporatization, this commercialization, this extreme, you know, managerial function, the way that things are structured, has continued to reinforce this disconnect.
Oh, for sure. The had a technical problem. I won't name the company, but some archives are lost. And so I went to them and they said, well, here's the links that you can figure out how to find it yourself. In the old days, that would not have happened. The old days, meaning just like a decade ago, you would have a human being and you would engage them. And they would say, oh, yeah, let's solve this problem. A robot doesn't care. A robot is just following the sequence that was laid out by its overlord to produce profits and blah, 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 whatever else. But there's the human interaction is disappearing from customer service. I agree with you. It's a very strange thing to watch happening. And it's detrimental. We're being disconnected from each other, from human to human. There's a lot of research in the field of psychology that shows that social interactions are actually very crucial for optimal brain function, immune system health, and good behavior. So when you disconnect people from others, it's not good. It's not a good thing, but that's what's happening right before our eyes.
Yes, and you know, you started, I think, our conversation. You mentioned about COVID and the ramifications in way of COVID, and COVID seems like this thing that we're just starting to get far enough away from it to actually have some space, some more grounded and comfortable reflective space, especially for the general public. But it was a mass trauma of sorts, right? Like an individual trauma. Somebody might have a really bad accident or what have you. And it might take them some months or years to be able to reflect on that in a more therapeutic way that has a bit more objectivity. And it seems like the same thing is happening now with COVID, where this really significant event happened. And the specific thing that you're talking about, which is distancing ourselves from one another, was one of the core features of the experience itself. Not only did we all experience that, meaning, you know, we were kept separate from other people for a prolonged period of time, but we also had, again, this external kind of loudspeaker that the government and institutions were saying, you know, social distance, there are consequences and it's not good to be near people. And that kind of compressed traumatic experience that reinforced that particular quality seems to only be adding to the digital and technological version of it as we're describing as well.
Yeah, that was a very unfortunate choice of words, social distancing. They could have come up with something different. But you add social distancing, emotional distancing, isolation, loneliness, confusion. It was a mess, just an absolute mess. And it is a cultural trauma. And the research shows that when a certain generation experiences trauma, for instance, this was found true with generations, the children of those parents who were in Auschwitz and other concentration camps. It was such a horrible trauma for them, but it showed up in the genetics of their kids and their grandkids. So a trauma like that is not just localized in time, it affects the entire system, the genetic system downline. And so, yeah, COVID was a huge trauma, a planetary trauma that we'll be sorting out for a long time.
It really is something. I'm very curious to know what happens in the next 10 years or so, especially with the studies on health, you know, the long-term effects of people's health who um, had the various versions of experiencing it, and which I presume is the large majority of the world population. I would think more than this is totally guessing, but I have always been under the assumption now for some years that more than 90% of the entire world's population has had COVID in one form or another, which is quite a mass exposure to something that could have quite deleterious effects long term. When we bring up these fundamental questions of consciousness, you said that there's like a long history of the idea of kind of maybe maybe a more unified perspective versus a fragmented one. What comes to mind, like if as a general sense, a starting point when we open up that big question of what is consciousness? Is there a starting point that arises for you when you try and put language to something as broad as that, or even abstract or ineffable as that?
Can you say that another way?
Could just say, what is consciousness?
Yeah, right. Um, well, the way I view it is that we have our conscious mind. You and I are having this conscious conversation. The words are coming out. We are hearing them, reflecting on them, but it's coming from a deeper place. It's coming from a subconscious place, a place where our brains are processing however you and I are going to respond to each other. We're not aware of that processing, but it's still there. That's the subconscious. Then there's the superconscious, which is totally non-localized and involves other dimensions and other realities, and they're all connected in unique and profound ways. So, as a human being, I believe we have the access to what we are consciously doing in the moment. If we pay attention and go deep in ourselves, we can find what our motivations are, what is underneath the veneer of our life, what is actually driving us, what are the issues that we're carrying subconsciously that we might not even be aware of consciously. And then that nests perfectly in what I call the superconscious, which is a much more global and much more complex system because it's pulling in information from other realms of existence, other realms of experience.
Tell me more about the superconscious. Curious about this, how it fits into your map.
I had a many, like in my 20s, I really got into the writings of Meher Baba, which is one of the world avatars. And by avatar, I mean a true world servant. He didn't take a workshop and get a certificate. He actually had the markings of a yogi or yogini who was an avatar, which means a being who has come to move the collective in a more positive direction through spiritual abilities and so forth. And he was a very powerful being. And I was, at that time, I was a musician. I'm still a musician, but I was really identified as a musician. I was the young, suffering musician, suffering for his art. And, my guitar and my songs were the most important thing to me. I had a vivid dream after a deep meditation with Meher Baba, and we're by a swimming pool. And so, in Jungian terms, water is a symbol of emotion. So we're by a pool that's holding all these emotions. And Meher Baba looks at me, and I know in that moment that if I look at him in his eyes at that moment, something terrible will happen. And my guitar starts to turn into dust right before me in the dream because I'm connecting to something that's more robust and extensive than my own self identity and is changing something in me. And that old part of me is going to turn into dust. And I said, no, no, no. And I woke up and the guitar reconfigured itself in the dream and I was done. Thank you, Meher Baba. So that's an example of a humorous and also interesting way of how the superconscious, what I call spirit, but it's this global, unbelievable, complex system we call consciousness, interacts with my personal psychology and my personal subpersonalities, and all together, it's all rolled together as a human being, but they are actually different fields of energy. So that's just one example of the superconscious coming in and giving me a message, which I did not listen to for several decades, by the way.
Well, you create these, dare I say, otherworldly soundscapes, sonic soundscapes, that are extremely evocative and healing and really inspiring. When you are kind of bringing forth these sonic tapestries or performing live stream, because some of your work is pre-recorded, multi-track, some is just real time. Um, are you tapping in to this super conscious, or is that your intention? And what has been that process for you of kind of learning to lean in and to trust that space and connection more?
Well, a lot of the sounds you're talking about come from the Hathors, which is a interdimensional group of beings. We could spend all day talking about them, but essentially they are in another dimension of consciousness and they can communicate with me and they would tell me when they would want a sound meditation and they would say, They usually gave me advance notice, but sometimes they would just wake me up at 3 in the morning. They like 3 in the morning for some reason. It may have to do with the hour Brahma, where the sun first hits the earth, that area starts to enliven. Um, anyway, what I noticed is that some of these, they would point out, we want you to do this at this day. It has to be this day. And I didn't even know what they were talking about. After the fact, I would look at it and it was a major astrological configuration or major sunspot activity. Something was going on in the cosmos that was somehow connected linearly through time by their request for me to do the sound meditation at that particular time. So the energies come into me and I feel them and I get out of the way. I don't calculate what the sound. If you're talking about my music, that's different. I'm making those notes happen. When I'm channeling the sound, it's coming from a different aspect and it's not personal, it's transpersonal. And so I have to get out of the way, have no agendas, no manipulation of the energy at all, just let it come through. And it has, when I'm able to do that, it has a power to it that's very clear. I was just an example of this coming from this other field, this amorphous field we're calling consciousness, channeling into me to make notes. It's coming from some other aspect. It's coming through me, but it's not coming from me. However, there's no way that a person can communicate something without affecting it somehow. So there's no such thing as a pure communication. All I can say is in my work, I try to be as pure as possible. But there's always going to be some type of, uh, because we're the interface, we're the antenna, but the information is coming through an antenna, and the antenna is going to affect what we get somehow, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. There's an inbuilt bias because of the nature of that the body itself, that this formation is biased. It has its own history and conditioning. There is no such thing as being uh, pure in the utmost sense. But you can, as you're saying, strive to and achieve higher and higher levels of reducing the distorted filter and allowing the signal to come through in the cleanest way that the instrument can possibly provide a resonator for.
Very nicely put.
I wonder if these, astrological points of reference and these timings that you're describing, sometimes I think of these nodules in time and these organizations at celestial levels as being like threads in the cosmic ethernet where there are certain nodal points or certain resonant moments where the information passes back and forth much more easily into and out from local to further abroad kinds of communication systems and things like that. So I'm fascinated by that kind of rhythm, which is more of a temporal rhythm when we talk at a more of a cosmic astrological scale. As much as there is a physical signifier, I think it's more about the structure of time and how information relates to time versus space.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, if you take one of the stars, say 1,200 light years away, and I or somebody's doing something in their internal world that they feel is significant. Oh, yeah, that alignment happened. Well, that alignment happened 12,000 years ago. Hello, dude.
Right.
So the entire cosmos rearranged itself so that you can receive this information at this point in time from something that happened so far in the past. It's a fascinating universe we live in, and who knows?
Right.
It's a yes and no.
Right. And this is just like knocking on the door of the absolute, going back to the reflections in the water, right? Or the fractal reflections through the trees. The sheer level of complexity of the informational environment that we're in is so astounding to think that the light information that my body is receiving right now, if I step outside, is a composite of not only the sun, but of stars sending information through their light that are littered with 12,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. And that light carries information and it's only reaching now, right? And that information isn't a one-way street, that presumably we're doing things that sends information back out to those very same origin points. And it's just we know so little. And maybe we're not supposed to know that much. Maybe that's a human thing, is to only be able to compute or function or interact with oh so much information. But at a more humble level, to just really soak in the absolute, vastness of things. I don't know, but the work you do definitely evokes that in me.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. Other people say the same thing. I'm sure it doesn't work for everyone. But if you're tuned into this non-ordinary aspect of consciousness, sound in music is a very powerful ally to explore those worlds, which is why chanting and mantras have been used for millennia. Uh, Singing, it's the architecture of music can mimic certain architectural features in human consciousness and open doorways. It's just extraordinary vehicle, the use of sound.
Yeah, speaking about sound, more and more, I'm really intrigued by sound's relationship to emotion because I find that when I reflect on how I used to relate to music. I was an active musician for a long time, and I didn't know or think of it at the time, but when I reflect now, I see that the way that I listened to and participated in both consuming and producing music was so related to almost like an emotional regulation, and so I'm curious what you think about their sound in the maybe the utmost sense of vibration and consciousness and things, and then downstream some kind of very, very direct communication to what we call emotions. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I reference Manfred Klein's and his work in synthetic theory. He was a brilliant, brilliant pianist, and he discovered he could make people cry by how he played the piano. And it turned out it was how he was approaching the piano, the pressure waves, which is interesting because pianos are not as pressure sensitive as some other instruments, but he was able to communicate that through the piano, and it led him into looking at synthics. And sound creates these waveforms, and some of them match emotions. He did, I don't know how these researchers did this, but they did all the many, many measurements on the Pietà, where Mother Mary is grieving the loss of her son. And it was a signature of grief. Literally, the visual architecture of the sculpture had the emotion of grief. So sound can also elicit emotions. And it's a very powerful thing when that happens, when sound creates an emotional response for a person.
What do you think of emotions in relation to this word consciousness? How do you contextualize emotions in our experience? Like what purpose they have?
Boy, that's a really big question. Um, well, there's a couple of things. Um, Part of it is for me, if I look at my life, my day-to-day life is a cascade of different emotions in response to different things. And so there is the emotion of, let's say, irritation. And what I found is that if I'm in a certain mental state, the irritation doesn't have a big effect on me. Um, for instance, I was in the kitchen the other day and knocked over a glass pitcher by accident. And I looked down at it and I yelled at it, but not like I used to. I used to really yell at inanimate objects, being I get really angry and start yelling at them and breaking them. In fact, one of my favorite incidents of my own neurosis was in my 20s when I was working on a sabotage part of myself I called Liz. It was a giant lizard that I would every night in my dreams, I would see this lizard. So I'm in my early 20s. This is when you individuate in coming to the world. So in my dream world, some part of me was trying to kill me to keep me from stepping into the world as Tom. So I had this it's went months and months, and I was doing non-dominant journaling where you write, if you're right-handed, you write with the question with your right hand and you answer it with the left hand. And it's scrawly. It's not as well developed as your right hand, but it's a way to communicate with that part of yourself that's unconscious. So I was using this method to communicate with the lizard. Finally, I said, "What is your name?" And he said, "Just call me Liz, lizard." And so this went on for months. And then there was a night, it was like 3 in the morning. This is way before cell phones. This is when you had old phone lines. And if you had a long distance call, you would hear on the background that you'd have to listen through. So it was definitely a long distance call, 3 o'clock in the morning. And the voice says, "Is Liz there?" And I said, "Yes." And I wish she'd fucking leave. That was, of course, a synchronicity from the standpoint of Carl Jung. I mean, out of the blue, why would somebody call that number at 3 o'clock in the morning? Does it mean anything? I don't know. It's just a significator, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's important. It was just something, a conglomeration, all these different forces at the same time. So we've gone off in a tangent, but I was addressing essentially the paradox of human consciousness and neurosis.
Which in one way or another, everybody has some version of.
We all have something. Yeah.
I am really intrigued by the paradox of unity versus separation, and you brought that up earlier. I think it's such a critical point because we can talk about these things. We can cognitively, intellectually talk about it. Somebody could read the great spiritual texts of the world and see how there's this idea of the unity of consciousness, the drop becomes the ocean, that separation is an illusion. But how do we know that? The value of knowing it, the mystical, direct experience, the awakening to non-separateness, the role of that in the process of understanding what consciousness is. Because we're talking about consciousness, and fundamentally, there are two big differing perspectives. One is that consciousness is an emergent property that is materially bound, right? The paradigm of today, which is like your body, your physical body creates consciousness. Consciousness isn't fundamental, it's not first. Mind isn't fundamental, it's not before the body. The body creates a mind and this property of consciousness, or its inverse, right? And the inverse being consciousness is what's most fundamental: beingness, existence, awareness, pure consciousness, whatever words. And then from that springs forth mind and form, and then ultimately what's you could call the language of descension, or the fall into matter, into this lower dimensional subspace of causation that we call the physical realm. How do we approach this scientific component, which wants to measure everything and people are so reliant on, versus trying to actually get to it from a, hey, I know that. It's not a question for me. It's not a cognitive, philosophical, measured thing. It's a, no, I know that directly. I've experienced things that show me that my mind and what's being called spirit or consciousness or the vastness of connectivity is not just physically bound.
Right. And so your question is what specifically?
I guess your thoughts on kind of navigating this paradox that you're describing, in the sense that, if I were to call the paradox, or how I'm hearing the paradox, is, on the one hand, there's the intellectual component where we can talk about it, and then the other hand, there's the direct experience, and that they don't necessarily, they both can be existent, and yet they require different domains of inquiry. It's probably not the paradox you were describing, but it's how I'm hearing it.
Well, let me talk about that from two different experiences I had that are very different, but they overlap. And so first of all, I'd like to look at this consciousness as the mystery that it is, separate from the religious and spiritual traditions that have been built up that tell you how you should approach that mystery. So I want to put that in. I want to come back to that because it's a very important point, I think. But the two experiences I had, well, I think will elucidate what I'm talking about in the confusion of how do you approach consciousness. So when I was 18, I had a very powerful mystical experience. I went into samadhi spontaneously. I tried to sort that out, and the first place I went to was my own spiritual religious training, which was Christianity. So I went into exploring the Christian mystics, and it took me back to the medieval mystics, St. John of the Cross and St. Francis of Assisi and Teresa Avignon and all those people, and how they viewed things. And so what would come out of that tradition for me was agape, divine love. So the divine love, agape, is a force that is experienced when you're in the Christos ethos, the mystery of not the church. I don't want to separate this from the church because there's a lot of different things going on there. But in its essence, when you're in the conduit, so we speak, of an expectation and belief about divine love, that will influence your experience. So I was out, it was at night. I was at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. I had been practicing the contemplative prayer for many hours, so I was deeply altered. So my consciousness was altered. I was on the golf course by myself. It was twilight. It's turning to pitch dark. I was standing there and I saw all these cars. It was rush hour. People were coming home from work. And suddenly I felt this unbelievable sense of love for everything all the people that were coming. Now, this is a very odd state, but what my experience in that moment was I could feel the people, all their hopes and dreams. I could feel the power of life. I could sense the internal combustion in the engines, the fire that was driving the cars that allowed them to go home to to um, have what they wanted next in that moment of their life. All of that was somehow the same mystery, expressing it itself in so many different forms, to the point where I heard crickets in the grass, and I was not on drugs, by the way. I heard crickets and I looked down at them and I felt the love for them, the same love I felt for the people out in the cars. Now, this was through the lens of the Christian ethos. I, many years later, went into Dzogchen, which is a particular form of Buddhism, for direct encounter with consciousness itself. And when I entered through that gateway, I had a similar experience in that it was all pervasive love. Everything is connected. I may see things as totally distinct and separate, but there's also another part where it's all interconnected. So it's both separate and connected at the same time. So as human beings, we have matter, and matter expresses itself as a particle or wave. So literally, the particles that make up our body can transmorph into something that's a waveform function, more fluid. So all this is all together. The complexity and the simplicity all exist simultaneously. But what I wanted to point out, these two methods, one was the Christian path and one was the Buddhist path, led to a place where they agreed, if I were to articulate what the statement was, yes, love is the force that moves through the universe constantly. Everything is connected through this sense of love. But the Christian part had an aspect of guilt, which was not part when I went through the Dzogchen. And very interesting, I've talked to friends who are Buddhists, and they also feel guilt when they grew up as a Buddhist because there's all, like everything, all religions twist things around. But the central feature of the direct access through Dzogchen to pure consciousness was similar, but also a little different than what I experienced through the Christian mythos. And I've experienced through Taoism and shamanism and other methods. And there's a place where they all converge and they would all agree on certain aspects of what consciousness is and what it means for a human being.
It's interesting that you're echoing what I'm hearing from the way in which you're creating music in those super consciousness connected states and acknowledging the limitations of the bias of the filter, that there's some filter regardless. And the same now is being applied in this interesting way that even when we're talking about opening up to the most unified, pure ground state of being, right? Spoken of in all different religions, the religion itself becomes a filter. The religion itself becomes a container.
Yes. And it will define what is possible and what is not possible unless you transcend it.
Right. And so we have the saying in Buddhism, if you are on the road to enlightenment and you see the Buddha, to kill the Buddha. So this idea that there's this thing that the psyche grokks onto a representation or a system as a crutch, as a pivot, because there's almost for many psyches this required strength or structure to help guide through that process out of the Maya. And at a certain point, you kind of get to the edge of where that system can take you based on its own internal representations of symbology and master archetypes like a Buddha, like a Christ, what have you. And when you get there in Buddhism, they're already telling you, like, just slay the Buddha. You got to get past that representation. And I've heard this in many mystical experiences that people often have this kind of meeting or passageway towards the end of that passage in which they do encounter the the master representation from their particular spiritual tradition that they need to transcend that as well.
Yeah, yeah, right. Because the path of the Buddha was the path he took, Gautama Buddha. There have been thousands, hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of Buddhas, many of them female. But the Buddha of our era is Gautama, and that was his path. But another being who would reach enlightenment will have his or her path separate from the Buddha's path because it has to follow your intrinsic, deep, authentic nature. That's where the goal, that's where you'll find it, not through mimicking somebody else. Up to a point, you can make progress, but there's a point where you have to deal with yourself.
Did you find, or have you found that you have particular resonance with a certain tradition? Like that, has that just changed over time, or do certain things, certain traditions really resonate with you more? Or I don't want to really say like offer a more pure vessel. That's probably an unfair question.
I've found the extremely elevated states in every tradition I've worked in, to be honest. What speaks the deepest to me, probably because I've had so many incarnations as a Buddhist, a yogi, are those methods. So you asked that question at an interesting point. And so I should probably have started this entire conversation by saying to you, I'm speaking to you from my current level of misunderstanding, meaning that no matter how much we understand, there's so much more it's vaster than we can ever imagine. So that's where that's coming from. But when you ask that moment, since we're striving to have an authentic conversation, nothing has been pre-scripted. It's just in the moment, what you say, how I respond. So when you ask that question to me, it's like some part of me is like, well, I'm not sure we could talk about that right now because we don't really have absolute clarity on this, and we are disagreeing with the Dharma. We are disagreeing with a fundamental statement in many Buddhist traditions. So I'm not sure we want to talk about that. But in the interest of authenticity and see where it will take us, let's talk about it. I, at this point, feel that there's an error in Buddhism as it is worked in the United States, in Western cultures. I became a student of Carl Jung's very early, and I remember in my mid-20s was when I really started to immerse myself in his writings. And he said it's not possible for Western psyche to become Buddhist because the psyche has been rooted in something that is so fundamentally different. You'd have to spend so much time excavating through the bullshit to get to what is actually authentic that then you could grow on. So I was very angry with him for that because I'm going to prove him wrong. So he's right. In my experience, he's right. So for me, what the error is, and I think that if we could have Gautama sit in this room with us, and you and me, he could clarify this because I think it's a very fine, fine point. But the point that makes me go, not, I don't think that's quite right. There's the dichotomy between enlightenment and non-enlightenment, between a being who is spiritual and not spiritual, between thoughts and no thought. There's this whole thing that goes on in I would say, the deeper, more refined questioning that arises out of Buddhism as as I begin to look at myself. And what I see in myself are where I'm attached to things. I want something to happen. So I will leverage my energy to make it happen. So that is how our psyches work in the Western culture. In the Eastern culture, it's more aware, just floating in the awareness of things. So there is, see, it's hard to even articulate, but the fundamental point in as this juncture in Buddhism is that some of our experience is rooted in our enlightened mind, a bodhisattva. Another part of our experience is rooted in our delusions and our hubris and our attachment to things happening a certain way. So there is this place where some people get into some type of ennui and when they go into Buddhism. It's like, and there's this place where some people do not engage their life at all. They do not engage it. They're floating off. That is a big temptation. I don't think that's going to lead us any place we want to really go. It's just perpetuation of self-delusion. There's a part of us that wants to make things happen. There's a part of us that can relax into the luminous aspect of our own consciousness. But there are certain aspects where in Buddhism where it said that's wrong. You engaging the world is wrong. Engaging your body is wrong. Engaging your senses is wrong. You need to pay attention to this. I think it's paying attention to both. the individual aspects of being a human being and the amorphous vastness of consciousness itself. I think it's both simultaneously. It's not one or the other. That's my quandary. That's the point I'm in when you ask that question. I'm actually wrestling with that myself in the minutia of my day-to-day life and how I think and respond to situations. Why am I doing this? How am I doing it? What's influencing me? I don't know if I articulated that very well, but that's close to it.
I love where you're going with all of that and continuing to kind of reflect humbly on the limitations of any particular system, that the system will have its own intrinsic filters. And Buddhism, especially the, Theravada original, closest to original, what the Buddha actually said, apparently, which is its own game of telephone, hundreds of years after he lived, before the Pali Canon was ever even written. Of course, there's going to be bias in that because it's something from 2,200 years ago, 2003, 400 years ago, through that culture, through that system, through that language, through those disciples. And inherently, there is a lot of potential distortion. And that division, Eastern and the Western traditions, Jung's participation. I remember my small forays into Jung in comparison to being immersed. Just him saying that he really felt that in the long run, that the balancing of the deficiencies of the Western psyche would be met by an integration of the Eastern psyche and the Eastern traditions. That the combination of the two would come together and strike the balance and kind of heal and upright both of them, because there's such a different emphasis on the two. And when I reflect on those two, I tend to think of individualist versus collective ways that the ego gets tilted, and that the Western ego is very individualized. And there's this emphasis in the personal striving, the personal ego versus the collectivist version. And it's very, very hard for the Western mind, and a Western conditioned mind to truly be able to sit in a clean relationship with a Buddhism or a yoga or a Taoism or what have you, because we're already so conditioned coming in. And yet, interestingly, I do feel that that's the big appeal to many people as well, that so many Westerners who are seeking a spiritual tradition that resonates with them, of course, it's going to be often leaving the one that's familiar. So leaving some Judaica tradition version and going to something else on offer. Well, what is on offer? Well, all that stuff from the East. And it doesn't have a lot of the same dressings and trappings that the Western stuff does. And that the ego is deeply, deeply minimized in those Eastern traditions, the very thing that's so out of balance to the Westerner in the first place. And there's also a much cleaner presentation of what spirit might be. Like, it's not dressed up in, usually in figures as God themselves, so to speak, or as some divine being, so to speak, but rather individuals who can just discover things within themselves in this a little more approachable way than the ego reification of some of the Western kinds of ways of presumably misreading Western traditions, but nonetheless the mainstream reading of Western traditions, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I have had a similar path in that I have found most resonance with the Eastern traditions. And that's really the first time when I was exposed to both Buddhism and yogic traditions, that it was the first time that I truly had a connection to any spiritual tradition. Growing up, I didn't have any connections to my Christian or Jewish, household traditions. They just didn't resonate with me. I wasn't interested, wasn't attracted. But something really jumped off the page when it came to Buddhism in particular. And here I was reading sutras for the first time in my life, reading religious texts and stuff. And I've always been fascinated by that, and why that occurred, or why that occurs to so many Westerners.
Well, you said something at the very beginning of our conversation about me being a sound healer, and I think it would be a good thing to flesh that out a little bit, in that um, there's a mysterious transfer of energies that takes place that allows you and me to hear each other speak and hear music and sound in general. Are you locked in? You're not moving? Oh, you're still there? Okay. It looked like we were frozen. Um, so sound is defined as a vibration moving through a medium, such as air or water. If you have something that's vibrating, say in a vacuum, there won't be any sound because there's no medium to carry it. So that it has to have a medium to carry the vibration. So when you literally the process of hearing is what I'd like to take a look at. Your ears have these little ear canals, and what happens is the air is vibrating. The air is the medium, so the air molecules are vibrating and hit inside the inner ear like a little drum. And literally, it's creating a vibration, and it's a bone. Little bones are hitting the drum that the sound is creating the movement. So we have air becoming earth. That's bones are the earth element from a Taoist perspective, and also from the Bampo tradition. So we have air moving, creating earth, and then earth hits water. There's a water inside this little drum, and there's little hair filaments that pick up the vibrations that are traveling through the water. So we actually are having air affecting earth, affecting water. And then that goes into the occipital areas of the brain and creates electrical charges in between all the synapses that are involved. So you have electricity. So we have this very important esoteric point that just the act of hearing is a miracle from the standpoint of the transformation of the fundamental archetypes of the elements, the fundamental classical elements, not the elements out of the periodic table, but the elements out of classical Greek philosophy, Chinese Taoism, et cetera, and the elements are earth, air, fire, and water. And so just the acts, we do not recognize the miracle that we live in because it's so commonplace. But just the act of hearing a TV commercial or a dog bark or you speaking or any sound at all is a transformational miracle of air into earth, bones hitting water, hitting electrical transmitters in the brain. I mean, it's extraordinary. And if somehow we could rest in that awareness of how miraculous our life actually is. When you put all the problems and bullshit aside, you just look at what's actually happening at the level of the atoms and the construction of our organs and our body and how we experience the universe. It's a miracle. So when you started saying, yes, I was a sound healer, I wanted to mention that because I think it's a significant underpinning to our conversation because we are having conversations we are drawing from the structures of the atomic structures in our bodies and our brains are actually creating this phenomenon that we are calling a conversation. And we're having this conversation because it's being facilitated by the transformation of the fundamental elements of classic Taoism and Greek philosophy.
I love that. And it makes me just go, and that may very well be framed by saying this is all fractal. And by that, I simply mean it's a repetition of every moment of every thing is a repetition of the very same thing that began everything, which is this movement through something from nothing to something, and then that something being an expression of all the things in perfect interrelationship to create some kind of next formation, next moment, next movement. And regardless of how mundane a moment might seem, all of those elements that began are still present, and all of those transformations and interrelationships are continually active if we're receptive to just listening to it.
Yeah, right. And at this point in my life, I'm listening more and more, talking less and less, just watching the mystery, finding the best mental state for me for the greatest progression of my own consciousness is being present and watching, resting into the miracles that are actually happening instead of trying to make something happen. I still make things happen. You have to. You have to wash the dishes when we're done. But uh, paying attention to the mystery, trying to rest in that mystery of the miracle that is our experience as a human being is very, very poignant and profound and helpful.
You said just a few moments ago about the ennui that can enter into people who may take on like a Buddhist orientation because there's this introduction of a kind of a detachment from things, like learn to witness, learn to be receptive, learn to just be present with things, but keep, in a certain sense, keep chiseling it away at all of the kind of, tendrils of attachment that we have built up. And that's usually like the deconstructive phase. of developing in being able to be more present is usually there's a lot of deconstruction rather than reconstruction that needs to start. And then you come to a certain point where maybe there's enough deconstruction or enough stillness and presence where you say, so how do I participate in the world? And you talked about simultaneity, not to deny any part, but to appreciate all of these things happening together in an integrated way. How do you take forward that sense of where does my sense of doing come from? Where do you like to take your cue from amongst the different, inner voices or drives that you can have? And how important do you feel is that externalization of your existence versus how you're tending to the internal?
I think for me, it's both simultaneously. Actually, one takes precedence, but the other one comes in on the heels of the other one. Um, when I am in what's called rigpa, which is the state of it's just pure awareness. There's no wanting to make anything happen. There's no pressure to make anything. There's no neurotic drives. There's nothing happening. It's just awareness, and it can happen in a gap of a few seconds between thoughts or between actions. When I'm resting in Rigpa, I just feel that everything is okay. I don't need to do anything. Cool, dude. Don't need to do anything. It's all happening. Then there's the part of life that requires some action. And so that's the tightrope of human existence. And there's that phrase that says, before enlightenment, chopping wood, carrying water. After enlightenment, chopping wood, carrying water.
And there's another paradox again, the doing and the non-doing, as the Taoists, doing non-doing rather, as Taoists might say. Are you compelled by the idea that there is an external manifestation that is relevant and important to do, to carry out, versus cultivating higher levels of peaceability, of ease, flow, love internally? Is there the temptation, or how do you reflect on that? Does it really matter what the outside looks like at all? If you take things to the extreme, does it matter what the outside looks like at all?
The extreme, no. When I'm in extreme Rigpa, nothing matters. I mean, everything matters, but nothing matters. I mean, that's a strange comment, but it's like the minutia of existence is all happening, but there's something more profound taking place, and all I have to do is rest in it and be aware and not have to do anything. But then life has its necessities, and then I have to do something. So I kind of walk a tightrope between these two, and I'm experimenting with being in that space of Rigpa-like. There's no literal Rigpa. You're either in it or you're not. Rigpa is simply meaning your cognitive thinking process has stopped. It's not dissociation. It's not dullness. It's being very aware and alert, but there's no thought. That's Rigpa. So when that happens, it's usually small windows. And so I can do something, but I'm not engaged in trying to make it happen and have neurotic anxiety. Oh, will this work out? That doesn't take place in that when I can hold that space where both can take place. The particle and the wave can take place simultaneously in me and doing something happening, making something happen in my life and just being resting in awareness. They are compatible in unusual ways. And for me, that's the most richly rewarding part of my journey at this moment is bringing these two polarities together for me. That's my path.
It does seem to be unavoidable to have to face deep levels of paradox, to be able to consider these things, experience these things, and act upon these things in some level of succession. If one goes through this chopping wood to chopping wood experience, because there is a reckoning with what does that mean to know or to realize some of these foundational things we're talking about, and then to continue being a human being, continue being an interactive and participatory member of the world, whilst also being informed by the context of the world, which the Buddha very eloquently, I think, described.
Yeah, it's a very interesting state to have those two operating simultaneously.
Do you have a biggest project or desire that compels you? Is there a thing that is number one on your list when you think of that inner voice that says, "Hey, get that one done," or make sure to do that? Is there a thing?
There's some things, yeah, but there's nothing concrete to point to and say this is it. Mostly, what I'm doing is resting in nature more because we're moving into winter here in the Northwest, so everything's more your whole environment your body wants to go in. So it's the time of introspection. So I'm experimenting with some Dzogchen methods. But as far as my sense is that after the first of the year, whatever this thing that's inside of me that wants to express itself is going to come forward. Right now, it's too embryonic for me to say what it is or to give it form in terms of a teaching or anything like that.
So you're picking up on something new has been seeded and is like, as you're saying, is gestating and will, in a certain sense, be both revealed and born in its own course.
Right, in its own course with no, I cannot affect it in any neurotic way. It has its own organic way to develop, and I'd best not contaminate it. Just watch it and enjoy it.
To return to the word simultaneity, and you were talking about Rigpa and it being a state of no thought. Do you think that there's a like a disjoint or a separation there where Rigpa disappears and the active mind is what is exclusive, or that Rigpa is ever present and it's just a matter of being more, let's say, present dominant in a Rigpa state, so to speak, versus a more busy mind state with the Rigpa moving to the background?
Well, I would reference my primary uh, teacher in Dzogchen, which would be Longchen Pa. He's called the Dharma King of the Great Expanse. He's one of the most consummate masters of Tibetan Buddhist Tantra and Dzogchen. And he says that Rigpa is ever constant. We are imposing something onto Rigpa. If we can just relax into Rigpa, it would be a very different experience. So I think he's right. I'm still at that point, between make things happen, allow things to happen. But I think he's right. I think that the non-localized aspect of the brain does not think. It receives information from so many different levels, different types of energies, textures, information, meaning. All of that is coming multidimensionally into the brain. So the mind is not thinking per se, the mind is receiving. But because we have been conditioned to be a certain way in this civilization at this time, we do certain things that we do because it makes us human, because we fit into society, we make a contribution. All those things are true. But Rigpa is a state, I guess it's the pre cognitive state of consciousness before consciousness moves into cognition and start to break things down into the minuscule levels that it can. Rigpa was the mother that births all of this, but she herself is not affected by it in any way.
Is Rigpa often ascribed as a feminine? I just noticed you said the she there.
That's my current exploration. I think that's yes, I think it is. They don't talk about it, and ultimately, they talk about it in Dzogchen through the metaphors of something called Samanta Bhadra and Samanta Bhadre. And Samanta Bhadre is the masculine aspect of existence of the entire all that edifice of the entire field of consciousness and existence is Samanta Bhadra, and his consort is Samanta Bhadre, feminine. When they come together, it is a very powerful tantric practice to bring their energies into your body, and that's what's happening at that deep fundamental level. Is those pure energies are coming in and affecting and changing your nervous system. But it's interesting when you look at Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism in general, and also this is true in India, in the yogas and Hinduism. The male aspect is emphasized and the female is not emphasized as much, even though if you look at the mechanics of creation, like behind me, I don't know if you can see that, that's the Kala Chakra Tantra, Yantra of Kala Chakra, which is the union of male and female at a very high elevated state. So, but so when you read in the writings about Samantabhadra is hardly ever mentioned, but she's his consort. In the mythology of Tibetan Buddhism, it was Padmasambhava. In order to complete his final work, he could not do it himself. He was called the second Buddha of our era by Gautama. He was predicted. This is the second Buddha of our era. He could not accomplish this without the benefit of feminine presence. He had to go. In the mythology, he went into the Hindu lands and went to um, Brahma and asked if his wife, Sarasvati, could send an emanation to Earth so that he could have a relationship with her to complete the great Maha work. So she incarnated, and he had a relationship with her, and he had a wife who took care of his daily needs, but with her, she was his consort, his equal, and they flew up into all over the place in Bhutan and Nepal. So even he could not do what he needed to do without a feminine energy. So I think if you look at the yogas that come out of Hinduism, some aspects of Taoism is also has this, and definitely some of the Buddhist aspects, the male is emphasized and the female is de-emphasized. I think that's an error, a deep fundamental error. And I think it will be reconciled over God knows how many thousands of years.
There's some reckoning that's been taking place now, and recently for sure. But yes, that does seem that masculine feminine polarity needs to continue to rebalance, and it will probably take quite a long time. The feminine principle is the operative principle of negation and emptiness and foundation and birth, like that at the bottom of the barrel is the feminine because all is born from the feminine. So
Females are about relationship also. They're much more tuned into relationship than men are. You look at them in terms of hormonal profiles. So the goddess is intending aware of relationships. So, I mean, it's so amazing when you look at the feminine, masculine archetype as human beings, and then you go deeper into the subconscious, and we have the myths and the heroes, the gods and the goddesses, and we get down into the deep spiritual or pure consciousness, you still see the polarity operating, but at a more subtle level between what the Taoists would call yin and yang, feminine and the masculine. It's all interconnected in vast, mysterious ways. And enjoy the ride.
yes, very much enjoy the ride. I love peeling back the layers of going from the agreed upon forms of male female and then seeing these teachings and the layers and depths of mythology and archetypes and how that all winds up connecting the dots from the most superficial to the absolute deepest that you can go before you get to where you have to cross that bridge of transcendence, in which there no longer can be any division, and the two yin and yang representations are contained within the infinite circle.
Beautiful metaphor, the circle, the Taoist circle.
One of the best. I really feel like that one, for me, that's my favorite of all the big Eastern tradition symbols, only because I feel like it contains in such a clean way so many levels of wisdom that it just I don't know, perfectly represents so much and just stays away from a lot of the trappings of kind of more culturally specific ornamentation. Going to neuroscience because you have done so much work there, is there a study, is there a thing, if you had unlimited funds, you would do to either further your work and or like just a dream project you've always wanted to do? Because brain work is so compelling in this realm of researching consciousness.
Mhm. Well, I would be fascinated. I think the instrumentation will get subtle enough in the next several years to look at biophotonics at a deeper level, because there are biophotonic pathways in the body that constellate as organs and systems. So it'd be very interesting to see how biophotonics, the light particles that are comprised, a part of these tissues, how are they responding? What are the flows? And then how does emotion affect that? And how does music and sound affect the biophotonic flows in the body? Because I know they do from an experiential standpoint, not from a evidence-based at this point, other than peripheral. But I think that we will find that we are creating and recreating our bodies and our minds and our emotions 24 hours a day, whether we are awake or asleep. And the biophotonic fields of light that are in our body are a key to this.
Sounds like a very interesting field of study that I am completely in the dark about right now. I will have to check out some things about this. You said there are certain strings or connective pathways in which are highlighted, meaning more light are coming through certain kind of channels, dare I say, than others?
Revelation of what I'm read about biophotonics, what I've observed in healing when it takes place in psychotherapy in my office, how music and sound can facilitate that. I think music and sound and emotional rapport creates a flow of biophotonics that can be conducive to healing. So I didn't want to imply that the field of biophotonics is not talking about it this way. I'm saying I think how they're going to start talking about it in the next several years. I could be wrong.
Also, just looking at kind of, let's say, futuristic kind of things, we touched into AI for a moment. I'm just curious your general thoughts about that in relation to this big word consciousness. Obviously, many people in the mainstream sense are looking at AI as something like an emergent consciousness. Some people might call that. How do you view it in the context, in the way you think of consciousness, and what AI is and or could be?
Well, there's consciousness that is experienced by a biological entity, like a human being. There's consciousness that can be experienced by a robot. But they're very different categories of information because at this point, the robots do not have emotional rapport. They can mimic it, but they don't really have it. And so the experience that comes out of being a biological entity and consciousness is different than AI. And I have many concerns about AI. I think that it's going to be a very good tool, but people are not paying attention. For instance, people are walking around with their phones. I see them all the time, and they're not paying attention to their environment at all. They're just literally looking at their phones, walking down the sidewalk, peripherally glancing so they don't bump into anybody. And people are driving off bridges because Siri's telling them to go left or right, and they do that instead of paying attention. And people are actually having accidents. When my wife and I were in Iceland many years ago, Siri told us to go straight. And if we had gone straight, we would have been into the ocean. It was like a 150-foot drop or something. It's like, well, I'm glad we paid attention to the external reality and didn't just interface with the interface. So if people are going to interface totally with a, something that is non-biological, I think there would be prices to pay. I don't know what they're going to be, but it doesn't seem like a good thing. I think that AI, if it's used as a tool and is used in the higher interest of the higher human qualities, I think it'd be wonderful. But I'm afraid it's going to deteriorate into a mix of whatever, good and bad. I think I look at it optimistically and with skepticism.
Yeah, it does seem like this kind of very significant and mysterious tidal wave coming our way because of the sheer force will be so massive, and it's so hard to predict the amount of change that results. But yet, knowing that the change will be very significant. You likened it earlier to the Gutenberg press, which is a very significant comparison to put it alongside something of that level of influence.
I think it will definitely be as extensive as Gutenberg's. He changed the entire face of Europe. And so many things happen as a result of that. So the same thing will happen with AI. It's going to have, whole classes of occupations are going to disappear. Whole jobs, whole sectors of jobs for centuries just be gone. And you can say goodbye to customer service,
Oh my,
at least as far as
right. I'll pray that it gets a little better in those categories. My concern is really more than anything is the lessening of people's higher order thinking. That people will be very, very lured by not really learning to write very much anymore, not learning to think through problem solving very much anymore. Now, I know that a potential opportunity is that what we can do is our very creative ideas can be executed potentially with great facility, with greater ease, so that we can, if we envision greater realities, we can actually manifest those greater realities with greater ease. But at the same time, that kind of ground up ability to think creatively, to understand all of the steps, to generate ideas and use language to reflect those ideas back in a trial and error kind of way. If you just fast forward a generation or two, how much are those people, those children growing up, going to actually go through the process of being schooled and being educated in a way where they do kind of go through the rudiments of using the body and the mind in a somewhat grounded and organic way versus this very artificially puffed up kind of way?
Very big ramifications for education, how children are educated or not. We're on the cusp of something that we can't ever imagine how consequential it's going to be.
You know, when I think about the theme of today or themes, there's one thing that really stands out. And you talked about going off the cliff in Iceland, yet another version of this dissociation or disjoint nature of the difference between us being kind of competent, conscious agents in which we're navigating the world from a place of knowing and grounded through our bodies, grounded through our senses, and basically gathering truth and information in a reliable and reasonable manner versus kind of giving ourselves away to externalized authority in the form of whether it be, consumer apparatus or particularly technological apparatus that sometimes just becomes so off the page, so incongruent with what's actually happening that it starts to look ridiculous, that we can drive off a cliff or that we can see a box of, something on the shelf and the person working says, "I'm sorry, I can't do anything about that." And it's like, it's right there, right? But I'm really fascinated that this has kind of risen as a kind of a theme because in the context of consciousness, that seems a very appropriate way of talking about where we're at, which is consciousness is the most direct, the most obvious, the most simple, and yet the most profound thing in our experience. And yet we don't understand it. And we don't know how to kind of make sense of it, particularly at a social scientific level. It seems that based on what I'm hearing from you, your opinion and perspective, and my opinion and perspective tends to be that science doesn't really get it at this point. And yet science is the thing that people rely on for telling us the truth about these kinds of deep matters. So I find that there's this reflection, this thing that's come forward in us talking that reflects that very same element. Is there anything else that comes to mind for you regarding this topic of consciousness, something that we haven't touched into, or something that you want to share that maybe hasn't had enough space to look at today?
Well, I think that all of us involved in this human experience on planet Earth at this time, it's a difficult, challenging time for so many reasons. I think that it's helpful to remember that the reins of your life are in your hands and don't give them away to other people unless you're really sure. And even then, think twice about it.
I simply thank you, Tom, for your time today. Really appreciate connecting with me and sharing your thoughts on such a deep topic and just all the different places that we went. It was a really great pleasure to connect with you as always.
Nice talking with you. And if people are interested in free resources, they go to www.tomkenyon.com. There's a lot of free sound meditations, articles, scientific studies, etc.
We'll definitely direct them to that.
Okay, take care.
Thanks for being a part of the Future of Wellness. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It helps us reach more people and to make great episodes like this one. Learn more about field dynamics and why we think the future of wellness matters. Check us out at energyfielddynamics.com. See you next time.